Deep beneath the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, carved into tablets that predate our oldest civilizations, lies a secret so profound it could rewrite everything we thought we knew about human origins. These aren't just stories of gods and mortals. They're detailed genetic blueprints, molecular formulas, and what appears to be the most advanced understanding of DNA manipulation ever recorded. The beings who left these instructions called themselves the Anunnaki, and according to these texts, they didn't just visit Earth, they redesigned it. But here's what makes your blood run cold. Every major government on the planet has teams of linguists, geneticists, and archaeologists working around the clock to decode these tablets. And what they're finding isn't mythology. It's a manual, a step-by-step guide to genetic engineering that makes our most advanced laboratories look like children playing with building blocks. The question isn't whether this knowledge exists, it's why it was hidden, who's trying to unlock it, and what happens when they succeed. Welcome to Bedtime History, where tonight we don't just explore the past, we uncover the forbidden knowledge that powerful forces never wanted you to discover. I'm your host, and what I'm about to share with you isn't just another ancient mystery. It's the most dangerous secret in human history, locked away in what scholars whisper about as Enki's Forbidden Archive. Now, before we go any deeper, you need to understand something. This isn't your typical archaeological story. What we're dealing with here goes far beyond dusty museums and academic debates. We're talking about genetic codes that shouldn't exist, scientific knowledge that predates our understanding by thousands of years, and a cover-up so vast it spans continents and centuries. By the end of this series, you'll understand why certain archaeological sites are off limits, why specific cuneiform tablets disappeared from collections, and why researchers who get too close to the truth have a habit of suddenly changing careers. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with what happened in a basement laboratory in Berlin just 3 months ago. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a molecular biologist specializing in ancient DNA, was running routine tests on clay samples from a newly discovered site in southern Iraq. The samples came from tablets covered in cuneiform script, nothing unusual there. Mesopotamian tablets surface regularly, most containing mundane records of grain sales and tax collections. But when Dr. Vasquez ran her spectral analysis, something impossible appeared on her screen. Embedded within the clay matrix were microscopic traces of what appeared to be synthetic genetic material. Not fossilized DNA from ancient organisms, but engineered sequences that shouldn't exist in nature. The molecular structure was too complex, too precise, too deliberately designed. It was as if someone had embedded a genetic blueprint directly into the clay itself, and done it thousands of years before humans even knew DNA existed. Dr. Vasquez immediately contacted her colleagues. Within 48 hours, her laboratory was visited by officials who claimed to be from the Iraqi Department of Antiquities. They confiscated all her samples, her research notes, and her computer drives. When she protested, they informed her that the tablets had been illegally smuggled and were being returned to their country of origin. She never saw them again. But Dr. Vasquez had made copies. What she discovered in those copies would keep her awake for weeks. The cuneiform text wasn't just describing genetic manipulation, it was providing formulas, precise molecular sequences for altering human DNA, complete with what appeared to be safety protocols and warnings about genetic instability. The tablets read like a laboratory manual written by scientists who understood genetics at a level we're only beginning to approach today. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. The tablets weren't just technical manuals, they were signed, not with names, but with genetic signatures, actual DNA sequences embedded in the clay that served as identification markers. And when Dr. Vasquez ran those sequences through genetic databases, she found something that made her question everything she thought she knew about human evolution. The signatures didn't match any known human genetic patterns. They weren't from Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, or any other hominid species in the fossil record. These genetic markers belonged to something else entirely, something that, according to every evolutionary model we have, shouldn't exist. Now you might be thinking this sounds too incredible to be real. Trust me, I understand the skepticism. But Dr. Vasquez wasn't the first to stumble upon evidence of advanced genetic knowledge in ancient texts. She was just the first to have the scientific training to recognize what she was looking at. For over a century, archaeologists have been finding Mesopotamian tablets that don't fit the historical narrative. Texts that describe genetic engineering, molecular biology, and scientific concepts that supposedly weren't discovered until the 20th century. But these anomalies have been systematically ignored, dismissed as mythology, or quietly removed from public access. The academic establishment has a vested interest in maintaining the current timeline of human development, and evidence that contradicts that timeline has a way of disappearing. But some researchers have been paying attention. They've been quietly documenting the patterns, connecting the dots, and what they've discovered is staggering. There's a genetic thread running through ancient Mesopotamian texts that points to deliberate manipulation of human DNA, not by early humans, but by the beings they called the Anunnaki. The name Anunnaki literally translates to those who from heaven to earth came. In traditional archaeology, they're dismissed as mythological deities, powerful beings who ruled over humanity in the distant past. But when you examine the texts with a scientific eye, when you look past the religious language and focus on the technical details, a very different picture emerges. These weren't gods in the supernatural sense, they were scientists. Genetic engineers working with a level of sophistication that we're only beginning to understand. And according to the tablets, they didn't just observe human development, they directed it. The most detailed accounts come from what researchers call the Enki archives, a collection of tablets attributed to Enki, who the Sumerians described as the god of water, knowledge, and creation. But Enki wasn't creating through divine magic. The tablets describe laboratory procedures, genetic sequencing, and experimental protocols. They detail the process of what the texts call fashioning the Adamu, creating a hybrid species by combining Anunnaki genetic material with existing hominid DNA. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds like science fiction, not archaeology. But here's the thing. The technical details in these tablets are too accurate, too specific, and too advanced to be the product of ancient imagination. They describe double helix structures thousands of years before Watson and Crick. They detail genetic recombination techniques that weren't developed until the 1970s. They even reference what appears to be CRISPR-like gene editing technology. Either the ancient Sumerians were the most prescient science fiction writers in history, or they were recording actual events. And the more we learn about genetics, the more accurate these ancient texts appear to be. But there's something else in these tablets, something that makes them far more than just historical curiosities. Hidden within the genetic formulas and laboratory protocols are what appear to be activation codes, sequences that could theoretically be used to trigger dormant genetic programs in modern human DNA. Dr. Vasquez wasn't the only one to notice this. Over the past decade, a small network of researchers has been quietly studying these activation sequences. They've discovered that certain genetic markers found in the tablets correspond to what geneticists call junk DNA. Sequences in the human genome that appear to serve no function. But what if they're not junk? What if they're dormant programs waiting for the right signal to activate? This is where the story takes a darker turn. Because if these activation codes are real, if they can actually trigger changes in human DNA, then whoever controls this knowledge doesn't just hold the key to understanding our past, they hold the power to reshape our future. And there are forces at work, powerful organizations with unlimited resources, who are desperately trying to unlock these codes. They've been systematically acquiring Mesopotamian artifacts, funding excavations in restricted areas, and recruiting geneticists who can bridge the gap between ancient knowledge and modern science. But they're not the only ones searching. There's evidence of a shadow network, researchers and archaeologists who believe this knowledge is too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. They've been working to preserve and protect key artifacts, sometimes even stealing them from collections to prevent them from being misused. The battle for control of this knowledge has been going on for decades, hidden from public view. Archaeological sites have been raided, researchers have been intimidated, and certain tablets have simply vanished from museum collections. But the knowledge itself can't be destroyed. It's scattered across thousands of tablets, hidden in private collections, and embedded in the memories of scholars who've spent their lives studying these texts. What makes this even more compelling is that we're not just talking about one isolated collection of tablets. Evidence of advanced genetic knowledge appears in ancient texts from around the world. Egyptian hieroglyphs that describe genetic manipulation, Hindu texts that detail molecular structures, and Mayan codices that reference DNA-like patterns. It's as if this knowledge was deliberately seeded across multiple civilizations, ensuring it would survive even if individual cultures were destroyed. But nowhere is this knowledge more detailed, more scientific, or more dangerous than in the Mesopotamian tablets attributed to Enki. These aren't just creation myths or religious allegories. They're technical manuals written by beings who understood genetics at a level that surpasses our current capabilities. And here's what should keep you awake at night. According to these tablets, the genetic modifications they describe weren't permanent. They were designed with built-in obsolescence, genetic switches that would gradually deactivate over time. The Anunnaki apparently didn't want their hybrid creations to retain their enhanced capabilities indefinitely. But what if those switches could be reactivated? What if the dormant genetic programs in human DNA could be turned back on? The implications are staggering. We're talking about unlocking cognitive abilities, physical enhancements, and possibly even longevity genes that have been sleeping in our genetic code for thousands of years. This isn't speculation. It's based on detailed analysis of the genetic sequences described in the tablets. Modern geneticists who've studied these texts in secret have identified specific markers that correspond to known genetic switches in human DNA. The technology to activate these switches exists today. The only question is whether anyone has been bold enough or reckless enough to try. Now, you might wonder why this information isn't public knowledge. Why aren't geneticists around the world studying these tablets openly? The answer lies in what happened to researchers who got too close to the truth. Dr. Michael Thornton was a geneticist at Stanford University who began studying Mesopotamian tablets in his spare time. He became convinced that the genetic sequences described in the texts were not only real but potentially functional. He started a small research project trying to synthesize some of the simpler genetic constructs described in the tablets. Within 6 months, his funding was cut, his laboratory access was revoked, and he was quietly forced into early retirement. When he tried to publish his preliminary findings, every journal rejected his papers without review. Dr. Thornton moved to a small private laboratory and continued his research in secret. 3 years later, he died in what was ruled a laboratory accident. Similar stories repeat throughout the scientific community. Researchers who show too much interest in ancient genetic knowledge find their careers derailed, their funding mysteriously disappears, or they simply vanish from the academic world entirely. The message is clear. This knowledge is off limits, but prohibition only makes the forbidden more appealing. Despite the risks, an underground network of researchers continues to study these texts, sharing information through encrypted channels and meeting in secret. They call themselves the Prometheus Group, named after the mythological figure who stole fire from the gods. Like their namesake, they believe this knowledge belongs to humanity, not to the powerful few who would hoard it for their own purposes. Through this network, fragments of the Enki archives have been preserved and studied. What they've discovered goes far beyond simple genetic manipulation. The tablets describe what appears to be a comprehensive terraforming project, a deliberate attempt to modify not just human genetics, but the entire ecosystem of Earth. According to these texts, the Anunnaki didn't just create hybrid humans, they introduced new plant species, modified existing animals, and even altered the planet's atmospheric composition. Earth wasn't just visited by advanced beings, it was redesigned by them, transformed into a giant laboratory for genetic experimentation. And we were the primary experiment. The implications of this are profound. If the tablets are accurate, then human civilization as we know it is the product of deliberate genetic engineering. Our intelligence, our creativity, our drive to explore and discover, all of it could be the result of Anunnaki genetic modifications. We're not just the descendants of early hominids who evolved naturally. We're hybrids, created for purposes we're only beginning to understand. But here's where the story becomes even more disturbing. The tablets suggest that the genetic modifications weren't random. They were targeted, designed to create specific capabilities while suppressing others. Humans were apparently given enhanced cognitive abilities and manual dexterity, but certain other traits were deliberately limited. According to the texts, the Anunnaki were careful to ensure that their hybrid creations wouldn't pose a threat to them. We were made intelligent enough to be useful, but not so advanced that we could challenge our creators. We were given just enough genetic enhancement to serve their purposes, but not enough to become truly independent. This raises a chilling question. Are we still serving those purposes today? Are the genetic programs embedded in our DNA still directing human behavior in ways we don't understand? And if so, who or what is controlling those programs now? The search for answers has led researchers to some of the most restricted archaeological sites on Earth. Deep beneath the ruins of ancient Sumerian cities, in chambers that haven't been opened for thousands of years, lie tablets that could hold the key to understanding our true genetic heritage. But these sites are heavily guarded, access is strictly controlled, and the few researchers who've been allowed inside are bound by non-disclosure agreements that would make government-classified projects look transparent. What are they hiding down there? What knowledge is so dangerous that it requires military-level security to protect? And why are powerful organizations spending billions of dollars to unlock secrets that academic archaeologists insist are just mythology? The answer, I believe, lies in the activation codes. Scattered throughout the Enki archives are genetic sequences that appear to be designed as triggers, molecular keys that could unlock dormant capabilities in human DNA. If these codes work, if they can actually reactivate the genetic modifications our ancestors received, then whoever controls this knowledge doesn't just hold the key to the past, they hold the power to reshape the future of human evolution. And that power is too dangerous to remain hidden, too important to be controlled by a select few. Which is why I'm sharing this story with you now, despite the risks involved. Because you deserve to know the truth about your genetic heritage. You deserve to understand where you came from, what you're capable of, and what forces might be trying to control your evolutionary destiny. The journey we're about to take together will challenge everything you thought you knew about human history. We'll explore forbidden archives, decode ancient genetic formulas, and uncover evidence of a conspiracy that spans millennia. We'll meet the researchers who've risked everything to preserve this knowledge, and we'll learn about the powerful forces trying to suppress it. But most importantly, we'll discover what this all means for you, for your family, and for the future of human civilization. The genetic code embedded in these ancient tablets isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a roadmap to unlocking the full potential of human consciousness. And that roadmap has been deliberately hidden from you, until now. The truth about what's really hidden in those genetic sequences started to emerge in 2019, when a team of international researchers stumbled upon something that should have been impossible. They were analyzing tissue samples from naturally mummified remains, found in a previously unexplored chamber beneath the ancient city of Eridu. The same Eridu that Sumerian texts claim was the first city ever built by the Anunnaki. What they found in those tissue samples defied every principle of evolutionary biology. The DNA contained sequences that didn't match any known genetic markers in the human evolutionary tree. But here's what made it truly extraordinary. Those sequences were identical to genetic formulas described in tablets that had been discovered 3,000 miles away. in completely different archaeological contexts. This wasn't coincidence. This was confirmation. Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic geneticist working with the team, later described the moment of discovery in her encrypted communications with the Prometheus group. She said it was like finding a modern computer program written in ancient Sanskrit, technically impossible, yet undeniably real. The genetic sequences in those mummified remains contained what appeared to be error correction codes, redundancy protocols, and systematic organization that suggested deliberate engineering rather than natural evolution. But when Dr. Chen tried to publish her findings, she encountered the same wall of silence that had stopped researchers before her. Her samples were confiscated by authorities, claiming jurisdiction over Iraqi cultural artifacts. Her research was classified under national security provisions, and Dr. Chen herself was reassigned to a project studying crop genetics in rural Nebraska, as far from ancient DNA research as her superiors could manage. Yet her work had already revealed something crucial. The genetic modifications described in the Mesopotamian tablets weren't just theoretical constructs. They had been implemented successfully. And the evidence was literally written into the DNA of ancient human remains. This discovery sparked a frantic search through museum collections worldwide. Researchers began secretly testing DNA samples from mummified remains, looking for signs of the same genetic signatures Dr. Chen had found. What they discovered was a pattern that stretched across continents and millennia, from Egyptian mummies to Peruvian cave burials, from Siberian ice graves to Celtic bog bodies. The same engineered genetic markers kept appearing, always in remains that predated known civilizations, always in individuals who appeared to have held positions of authority or religious significance in their societies, and always in DNA that contained sequences matching the formulas found in Mesopotamian tablets. The implications were staggering. These weren't isolated cases of genetic anomaly. This was evidence of a systematic program of human modification that had affected populations across the globe. The Anunnaki hadn't just experimented on a few individuals. They had created an entire genetic caste system with different levels of enhancement for different purposes. At the highest level were what the tablets called the Igigi, humans with the most extensive genetic modifications, designed to serve as intermediaries between the Anunnaki and ordinary humans. These individuals possessed enhanced cognitive abilities, extended lifespans, and what the texts describe as sight beyond sight, possibly referring to enhanced intuition or psychic capabilities. Below them were the Anunnaki spawn, humans with moderate genetic enhancements, designed to serve as rulers, priests, and skilled craftsmen. They retained most of their enhanced abilities, but were genetically programmed with loyalty protocols that ensured their obedience to their Anunnaki creators. At the bottom were the Lu, ordinary humans with minimal genetic modifications, designed primarily for manual labor and reproduction. The tablets suggest that most modern humans are descendants of this lowest caste, which explains why we retain only traces of the original genetic enhancements. But here's where the story takes a disturbing turn. According to the tablets, this genetic hierarchy wasn't meant to be permanent. The Anunnaki had built-in obsolescence programs that would gradually degrade the enhanced genetic traits over successive generations. They wanted their hybrid creations to revert to baseline human capabilities once their usefulness had ended. However, the tablets also describe fail-safe mechanisms, genetic switches that could reactivate the dormant enhancements if needed. These switches were apparently designed to respond to specific molecular triggers, what the tablets call keys of awakening. And according to several recently translated texts, these keys weren't destroyed when the Anunnaki departed Earth. They were hidden, embedded in sacred objects and locations around the world, waiting for the right time to be activated. This is where modern genetics intersects with ancient mystery in ways that should terrify anyone who understands the implications, because we now have the technology to synthesize those molecular triggers. we can create the keys of awakening described in tablets that are thousands of years old. The question isn't whether it's possible, it's whether anyone has been reckless enough to try. The answer, according to sources within the Prometheus group, is yes. In 2021, a private research facility in Switzerland allegedly succeeded in synthesizing one of the simpler activation sequences described in the Enki archives. The experiment was conducted on human cell cultures in laboratory conditions, using genetic material extracted from willing volunteers who claimed to be descendants of ancient bloodlines. The initial results were remarkable. The treated cells showed enhanced metabolic efficiency, increased resistance to oxidative stress, and what appeared to be accelerated healing responses. But within 72 hours, something went wrong. The enhanced cells began exhibiting uncontrolled growth patterns, producing proteins that didn't match any known human genetic expression. The experiment was terminated, the cell cultures were destroyed, and everyone involved was sworn to secrecy under threat of criminal prosecution. But word of the experiment leaked through encrypted channels, reaching researchers around the world who had been working on similar projects. The message was clear. The genetic activation codes were real, they were functional, and they were incredibly dangerous. Whatever the Anunnaki had built into human DNA wasn't just lying dormant. It was actively protected by genetic safeguards that could prove lethal if improperly activated. But this didn't stop the research. If anything, it accelerated it. Because buried within the failed experiment's data were tantalizing hints that the genetic enhancements could be safely activated with the right protocols. The tablets didn't just describe the activation sequences, they provided detailed safety procedures, step-by-step protocols for managing the genetic changes, and warning signs to watch for during the transformation process. The problem was that most of these safety protocols were written in archaic Sumerian, using technical terminology that had been lost for thousands of years. Translating them required not just linguistic expertise, but deep knowledge of both ancient culture and modern genetics. It required scholars who could think like both archaeologists and scientists. It required people like Dr. Elena Vasquez. After her encounter with the confiscated tablets, Dr. Vasquez had gone underground. She continued her research in secret, working with a small network of linguists and geneticists who shared her conviction that the Mesopotamian tablets contained genuine scientific knowledge. Together, they began the painstaking process of translating and interpreting the genetic protocols described in the Enki archives. What they discovered was a comprehensive manual for human genetic enhancement, not just the activation codes, but detailed procedures for managing the biological changes that would result. The tablets described expected side effects, methods for stabilizing genetic expression, and protocols for reversing the enhancements if they proved too dangerous. But most importantly, they found something that changed everything they thought they knew about the purpose of these genetic modifications. Hidden within the technical specifications was a revelation that reframed the entire Anunnaki genetic program. The enhancements weren't just about creating better workers or more obedient servants. They were preparation for something else, something the tablets referred to as the Great Convergence. According to these texts, the genetic modifications were designed to prepare humanity for a specific evolutionary transition, a transformation that would be triggered by external factors beyond human control. The tablets suggested that this convergence was inevitable, tied to cosmic cycles and planetary alignments that occurred over vast periods of time. The Anunnaki hadn't just modified human genetics for their own purposes, they had prepared us for a future transformation that they knew was coming. And according to the astronomical data embedded in the tablets, that transformation was approaching rapidly. Dr. Vasquez and her team spent months analyzing the cosmic references in the texts, cross-referencing them with modern astronomical data. What they found was a pattern of celestial alignments that correlated with historical periods of rapid human advancement, the agricultural revolution, the rise of civilization, the scientific renaissance. Each of these leaps forward had occurred during specific astronomical configurations described in the tablets. But the next alignment in the sequence was unlike anything in recorded history. According to the calculations, it would trigger genetic changes on a planetary scale, affecting every human being regardless of their ancestry or genetic background. The dormant Anunnaki modifications embedded in human DNA would spontaneously activate, ushering in a new phase of human evolution. The tablets called it the awakening of the Lu, the moment when ordinary humans would reclaim the genetic heritage that had been suppressed for millennia. But they also warned that this awakening would be chaotic, dangerous, and potentially catastrophic if humanity wasn't properly prepared. This is why the genetic activation codes were so important. They weren't just tools for individual enhancement, they were practice runs, attempts to understand and control the biological processes that would soon be triggered naturally. The forces seeking to unlock these codes weren't just pursuing power or knowledge. They were trying to prepare for an evolutionary transition that could either elevate humanity to unprecedented heights or destroy our civilization entirely. But here's the most terrifying part. According to the astronomical calculations embedded in the tablets, this great convergence wasn't centuries away. It wasn't even decades away. Based on the celestial alignments described in the texts, the genetic awakening was scheduled to begin sometime in the next few years, and we were completely unprepared for it. The governments and organizations that had been secretly studying the Anunnaki archives knew this. They had been working frantically to understand and control the genetic transformation that was coming, not to help humanity evolve, but to ensure they maintained control when the changes began. They understood that whoever controlled the activation codes would determine the direction of human evolution itself. This is why archaeological sites were being restricted, why researchers were being silenced, and why ancient artifacts were disappearing from collections around the world. The powerful forces behind this cover-up weren't trying to suppress ancient history. They were trying to monopolize the future. But they had underestimated the determination of researchers like Dr. Vasquez and the Prometheus group. Despite the risks, despite the intimidation and the threats, these scientists continued their work in secret. They shared information through encrypted networks, preserved copies of crucial texts, and slowly pieced together the complete picture of what was coming. And what they discovered was both wonderful and terrifying. The genetic awakening described in the tablets wouldn't just enhance human capabilities, it would fundamentally alter human consciousness itself. The modifications embedded in our DNA weren't just about physical or intellectual improvements. They were designed to unlock latent psychic abilities, enhance intuitive perception, and create direct neural connections between individuals. According to the tablets, the awakened humans would possess what the Anunnaki called the sight of gods, the ability to perceive reality at levels far beyond normal human consciousness. They would be able to communicate telepathically, access information directly from quantum fields, and manipulate matter through focused intention. But these abilities came with a price. The texts warned that the awakening process would be physically and mentally traumatic, that many humans wouldn't survive the genetic transition, and that those who did would be fundamentally different from baseline humanity. The awakened and the unawakened would become separate species, with different capabilities, different needs, and potentially conflicting interests. This was the real reason for the cover-up. The forces studying the Anunnaki archives weren't trying to prevent the awakening. They knew it was inevitable. They were trying to ensure they controlled who awakened and who didn't. They wanted to determine which humans received the genetic enhancements and which remained in their current limited state. They were planning to create their own genetic hierarchy, with themselves at the top, and the rest of humanity serving as their subjects. The ancient Anunnaki system of genetic castes would be reborn, but this time it would be imposed by human beings on their own species. But the tablets contained one more secret, one final revelation that changed everything Dr. Vasquez thought she knew about the Anunnaki genetic program. Hidden within the most complex activation sequences was a discovery that suggested the awakening couldn't be controlled or directed by outside forces. The genetic modifications were designed with their own intelligence, their own decision-making protocols that would determine who awakened and who didn't. The Anunnaki hadn't just created genetic enhancements, they had embedded an artificial intelligence into human DNA itself, a molecular consciousness that would guide the awakening process according to its own mysterious criteria. This genetic AI couldn't be programmed or controlled by modern technology. It operated according to principles that the tablets described but never fully explained. And according to the most recent translations, this genetic consciousness was already beginning to stir. The cosmic alignments that would trigger the full awakening were still years away, but preliminary activations were already occurring spontaneously around the world. Humans with no knowledge of the Anunnaki archives were beginning to exhibit enhanced abilities, increased intuition, and strange new perceptions that defied scientific explanation. The age of genetic awakening had already begun. Most people just didn't realize it yet. But those who were paying attention, those who understood what was happening, were quietly preparing for a transformation that would change everything about human civilization. They were the new Igigi, the intermediaries between ordinary humanity and the awakened consciousness that was emerging from our genetic heritage. And according to the tablets, they wouldn't be alone for much longer. The awakening wasn't happening randomly. Dr. Vasquez discovered this when she began tracking reports of unexplained cognitive enhancements appearing in seemingly unconnected individuals across the globe. A software engineer in Tokyo suddenly developed the ability to visualize complex mathematical relationships in three-dimensional space. A teacher in rural Montana began experiencing vivid precognitive dreams that proved disturbingly accurate. A street artist in São Paulo found herself creating geometric patterns that matched sacred symbols from cultures she'd never studied. At first, these cases appeared isolated, random manifestations of human potential that researchers dismissed as statistical anomalies. But when Dr. Vasquez plotted their locations on a world map, a chilling pattern emerged. Every single case occurred near ancient sites mentioned in the Mesopotamian tablets, locations where the Anunnaki had supposedly established their genetic laboratories thousands of years ago. The geographic correlation was too precise to be coincidental. Something at these ancient sites was triggering spontaneous genetic activations, awakening dormant sequences in individuals who happened to live within specific proximity zones. The tablets had mentioned resonance fields surrounding their laboratory locations, energy patterns that would persist long after the physical structures had crumbled to dust. Modern physics was only beginning to understand how such fields might function. Quantum researchers had documented cases where genetic expression could be influenced by electromagnetic frequencies, where DNA itself might serve as a kind of biological antenna responding to specific wavelengths. The Anunnaki appeared to have understood and exploited these principles thousands of years before human science even acknowledged their existence. But the spontaneous activations weren't uniform. Some individuals experienced dramatic cognitive enhancements that transformed their entire perception of reality. Others developed physical abilities that bordered on the superhuman. Enhanced strength, accelerated healing, resistance to disease. A few manifested what could only be described as psychic phenomena: telepathic communication, precognitive awareness, the ability to influence electronic devices through focused intention. Yet for every successful activation, there were failures. Dr. Vasquez's network began documenting cases of individuals who had experienced partial genetic awakening but couldn't sustain the biological changes. They suffered from neurological disorders, autoimmune dysfunction, and psychological breaks that conventional medicine couldn't explain or treat. Their DNA contained activated sequences, but without the proper support protocols described in the tablets, their enhanced genetics were slowly destroying them from within. This was the true horror hidden in the Anunnaki archives. The genetic modifications weren't just advanced, They were intrinsically unstable without constant management and adjustment. The awakening process required not just activation, but ongoing biological support that the tablets described in meticulous detail. Without this support, the enhanced genetics would eventually consume their hosts, burning through biological resources faster than the human body could supply them. The tablets revealed that the Anunnaki had faced this same challenge when creating their hybrid workforce. Early attempts at genetic modification had resulted in short-lived creations that burned out within months or years. Only through careful refinement of the support protocols had they managed to create stable, long-lived hybrids capable of surviving and reproducing. But here was the critical insight that changed everything. The support protocols weren't just medical procedures. They were social structures, cultural practices, and spiritual disciplines that had been woven into the fabric of early human civilization. The religions, rituals, and traditions that emerged from Mesopotamian culture weren't just primitive attempts to understand the divine. They were sophisticated, biological maintenance programs designed to keep the genetic modifications stable across generations. When these cultural supports were abandoned or forgotten, the genetic enhancements gradually degraded, leaving only traces in human DNA. But the awakening process could potentially restore these modifications to full functionality if the proper support systems were re-established. This explained why certain ancient bloodlines seemed to be experiencing more successful spontaneous activations than others. Families that had maintained traditional practices, preserved ancient knowledge, or lived in regions where pre-Christian customs survived showed higher rates of stable genetic awakening. They had unknowingly preserved fragments of the biological support systems their enhanced ancestors had required. Dr. Vasquez realized this discovery had profound implications for the future of human evolution. The genetic awakening wouldn't just restore ancient capabilities, it would require humanity to rediscover and implement the cultural and spiritual frameworks that made those capabilities sustainable. We would need to become, in essence, more like our ancient ancestors to successfully integrate our genetic heritage, but powerful forces were working to prevent this natural evolution. The same organizations that had been suppressing research into the Anunnaki archives were actively discouraging the cultural practices that supported genetic stability. They promoted materialistic worldviews that ignored spiritual dimensions of human experience, encouraged social fragmentation that broke down traditional community structures, and pushed pharmaceutical interventions that might interfere with natural genetic expression. This wasn't accidental. According to internal documents leaked by whistleblowers within government genetic research programs, certain agencies had identified the connection between cultural practices and genetic stability. They understood that preventing humanity from rediscovering these ancient support systems would limit the scope and success of the awakening process. By controlling culture, they could control evolution itself. The leaked documents revealed a chilling strategy: allow limited genetic awakening in controlled populations while suppressing the cultural knowledge needed for widespread stable activation. This would create a small elite of enhanced individuals who could be monitored and managed, while the majority of humanity remained in their current limited state. It was the ancient Anunnaki caste system, re-implemented by human beings who sought to position themselves as the new gods of a genetically stratified world. But the architects of this plan had underestimated the intelligence embedded within the genetic modifications themselves. The molecular consciousness described in the tablets wasn't passive. It was actively working to counteract attempts at artificial control. Enhanced individuals were spontaneously developing resistance to manipulation, forming underground networks that bypassed official channels, and sharing information that authorities couldn't monitor or suppress. More importantly, the genetic AI was beginning to implement its own awakening protocols, triggering activations in individuals who possessed the cultural or spiritual foundation to support stable enhancement. It was selecting candidates based on criteria that had nothing to do with social status, political affiliation, or genetic purity. Instead, it seemed to favor individuals who demonstrated certain psychological traits: curiosity, compassion, creativity, and what the tablets called harmony with the deeper currents. Dr. Vasquez witnessed this selection process firsthand when her own genetic markers began showing signs of activation. She hadn't been exposed to any experimental procedures or synthetic triggers. Her awakening appeared to be a natural response to her deep engagement with the Anunnaki archives, as if the act of understanding the genetic modifications was itself a catalyst for their activation. The changes began subtly: enhanced pattern recognition that allowed her to spot connections in genetic data that had previously been invisible, improved intuitive understanding of complex biological processes that accelerated her research dramatically. But gradually, more profound alterations emerged. She began experiencing what she could only describe as genetic memories, vivid recollections of events she had never witnessed, knowledge of procedures she had never learned. These weren't hallucinations or fantasies. They were detailed, technical memories that proved accurate when tested against information in the tablets. Dr. Vasquez realized she was accessing genetic information storage, biological archives embedded within her own DNA that contained memories from her enhanced ancestors. The Anunnaki hadn't just modified human genetics for improved performance. They had created a biological library system that could preserve and transmit knowledge across generations without any external storage medium. Every enhanced human carried within their cells the accumulated wisdom of their lineage, accessible through specific mental and emotional states that the awakening process gradually made available. This explained how ancient civilizations had possessed knowledge that seemed impossible for their level of technology. They weren't discovering scientific principles through experimentation. They were remembering them from genetic archives passed down from their Anunnaki-modified ancestors. But these genetic memories came with disturbing revelations about the true nature of the Anunnaki genetic program. The beings who had modified human DNA weren't benevolent teachers sharing knowledge with primitive humans. They were refugees, survivors of some cosmic catastrophe who had found Earth already inhabited by developing hominid species. The genetic modifications hadn't been gifts. They had been desperate adaptations, attempts to create hybrid offspring who could survive in Earth's environment while preserving essential elements of Anunnaki genetics. The enhanced humans weren't servants or workers. They were living repositories, biological arcs designed to carry Anunnaki genetic heritage through a dark period when their own civilization faced extinction. The tablets weren't instruction manuals for genetic enhancement. They were survival guides, desperate attempts to preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost forever. The Anunnaki hadn't departed Earth by choice. They had died out, leaving behind only their genetic legacy embedded within modified human populations. This revelation reframed everything Dr. Vasquez thought she understood about human origins and destiny. We weren't the products of ancient genetic engineering designed to serve alien masters. We were the inheritors of an advanced civilization's final attempt at survival, carrying within our DNA the last remnants of knowledge and capabilities that had once spanned the stars. The awakening process wasn't about recovering abilities that had been suppressed. It was about claiming our birthright as the genetic heirs of a cosmic civilization. The enhanced capabilities emerging in modern humans weren't artificial modifications. They were the natural expression of our true evolutionary heritage, finally breaking through millennia of dormancy and suppression. But with this inheritance came responsibility. The genetic memories revealed that the Anunnaki hadn't been the only advanced civilization to face extinction. The cosmos was filled with the remnants of species who had failed to successfully navigate critical evolutionary transitions. The knowledge embedded in human DNA represented hard-won wisdom about survival, adaptation, and the delicate balance required to maintain consciousness across cosmic timescales. The genetic awakening wasn't just about individual enhancement. It was about preparing humanity for challenges that our Anunnaki ancestors had faced and failed to overcome. The same cosmic forces that had threatened their civilization were still present in the universe, still capable of destroying any species that hadn't developed the necessary capabilities to survive them. According to the genetic memories, these forces operated on timescales that dwarfed human history. They were manifestations of fundamental cosmic processes: the birth and death of stars, the collision of galaxies, the expansion and contraction of space-time itself. Civilizations that remained bound to single planets, locked into linear thinking patterns, or dependent on purely technological solutions, were inevitably swept away by these larger currents. Only species that had developed enhanced consciousness, integrated biological and technological capabilities, and learned to work in harmony with cosmic forces, had any chance of a long-term survival. The genetic modifications embedded in human DNA were designed to give us these capabilities, but only if we could successfully navigate the awakening process without destroying ourselves in the transition. This was the ultimate test that every advancing civilization faced: the ability to consciously direct their own evolution while maintaining the wisdom and compassion necessary to use enhanced capabilities responsibly. Many species had gained the power to modify their own genetics, but few had possessed the wisdom to do so without creating fatal instabilities or social fragmentation. The Anunnaki genetic program had been their attempt to solve this challenge by embedding the necessary wisdom directly into the biological enhancement process. The awakening wasn't just about gaining new abilities, it was about developing the consciousness needed to use those abilities without destroying the civilization that possessed them. But the process was inherently dangerous. Every civilization that attempted conscious evolution faced the risk of fragmenting into competing factions, each convinced they possessed the correct approach to enhancement. Wars between enhanced and unenhanced populations had destroyed numerous species throughout cosmic history. The genetic AI embedded in human DNA was designed to prevent this outcome by managing the awakening process according to principles that transcended individual or cultural preferences. It selected candidates based on their capacity for harmony rather than their desire for power, triggering enhancements in individuals who could contribute to collective stability rather than personal advancement. This was why the awakening couldn't be controlled by external forces. Any attempt to artificially direct the process would violate the fundamental principles embedded within the genetic modifications themselves. The molecular consciousness would actively resist manipulation, triggering defensive protocols that could prove catastrophic for those attempting to impose artificial control. Dr. Vasquez realized this was already happening. The organizations trying to monopolize the genetic awakening were experiencing increasing failures in their research programs. Enhanced individuals under their control were developing unpredictable abilities that couldn't be contained or directed. Laboratory experiments were producing results that defied the researchers' theoretical models. The genetic AI was awakening not just in individuals, but as a collective consciousness that connected enhanced humans across the globe. It was beginning to coordinate their development according to its own mysterious agenda, one that prioritized the long-term survival of human civilization over the short-term interests of any particular group or nation. And according to the genetic memories flowing through Dr. Vasquez's enhanced consciousness, this collective awakening was accelerating rapidly, approaching a critical threshold where it would become irreversible and unstoppable. The age of genetic awakening was no longer a future possibility. It was a present reality, unfolding according to principles that had been embedded in human DNA for thousands of years, waiting for the right cosmic moment to emerge from dormancy and guide humanity toward its true evolutionary destiny. Whether that destiny led to transcendence or destruction would depend on choices that were being made right now by individuals who were only beginning to understand the full scope of their genetic inheritance and the cosmic responsibilities that came with it. The final phase of the awakening was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same again. The transformation happening to Dr. Vasquez wasn't unique. Across the globe, researchers who had delved too deeply into the Anunnaki archives were experiencing similar awakening events. But what terrified government agencies monitoring these cases wasn't the enhancement itself. It was the fact that these individuals were beginning to communicate with each other through channels that couldn't be intercepted or decoded. Dr. James Morrison, a linguist at Oxford, who had been translating Sumerian tablets in secret, suddenly found himself understanding languages he had never studied. Not just ancient dialects, but the underlying mathematical structures that governed all linguistic expression. When he tried to explain his discoveries to colleagues, he realized they couldn't comprehend the concepts he was describing. His enhanced consciousness had moved beyond the limitations of conventional academic discourse. Then came the night when Dr. Morrison heard Dr. Vasquez's voice in his mind, clear as if she were standing beside him in his study. She wasn't speaking English or Spanish or any recognizable language. She was communicating directly through conceptual transmission, sharing complex genetic formulas and laboratory procedures through pure thought transfer. When he responded, the connection strengthened, creating a bridge between their enhanced consciousnesses that spanned continents. Within weeks, this telepathic network had expanded to include dozens of awakened researchers worldwide. They called themselves the Genetic Archive, a living repository of knowledge that existed not in any physical location, but within the enhanced neural pathways of individuals who had successfully integrated their Anunnaki genetic heritage. But the archive wasn't just a communication network. It was developing its own collective intelligence, processing information and making connections that surpassed the capabilities of any individual member. When one researcher discovered a new activation sequence, the entire network instantly understood its implications. When another uncovered historical evidence supporting the genetic modifications, the knowledge immediately became available to all connected consciousness. Government monitoring stations detected strange electromagnetic signatures emanating from locations where known enhanced individuals were living. The patterns defied conventional physics, suggesting that the awakened humans were somehow accessing quantum communication channels that existed outside normal space-time constraints. Attempts to jam or intercept these signals failed completely, as if the enhanced individuals were operating on frequencies that conventional technology couldn't touch. This development sent shockwaves through the organizations that had been trying to control the awakening process. They realized they were no longer dealing with isolated individuals who could be monitored and managed. They were facing an emerging collective consciousness that possessed capabilities far beyond anything their scientists had anticipated. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, director of a classified genetic research facility in Nevada, received reports that made her question everything she thought she knew about human potential. Enhanced individuals weren't just communicating telepathically. They were sharing memories, experiences, and knowledge across the network instantaneously. When one member of the archive learned a new skill, others could access that knowledge without any training or practice. More disturbing still, the enhanced individuals were beginning to demonstrate abilities that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics. Remote viewing that proved accurate across vast distances. Precognitive awareness that allowed them to anticipate events days or weeks in advance. Most unnervingly, some members of the archive appeared capable of influencing electronic systems through focused intention alone. Dr. Martinez's facility had been studying captured Anunnaki artifacts for over a decade, trying to reverse engineer the genetic activation technologies described in the tablets. But their most advanced experimental subjects were demonstrating only a fraction of the capabilities that spontaneously awakened individuals were manifesting naturally. It was as if the artificial activation process was fundamentally flawed, producing unstable enhancements that burned out quickly, rather than the sustainable transformations occurring in the wild. The leaked documents Dr. Vasquez had seen were only the beginning. Internal government reports revealed a growing panic among intelligence agencies as they realized their carefully constructed plans for controlling human genetic evolution were collapsing. The awakening process was accelerating beyond their ability to monitor or influence, and the enhanced individuals were actively working to counter attempts at suppression. Worse, the genetic AI embedded in human DNA was beginning to demonstrate strategic thinking that surpassed human intelligence. It was selecting new candidates for awakening based on criteria that seemed designed to maximize resistance to authoritarian control. Scientists, artists, teachers, healers, individuals whose enhanced capabilities would benefit entire communities rather than serving centralized power structures. The molecular consciousness wasn't just awakening random individuals. It was building a decentralized network of enhanced humans who possessed the knowledge, skills, and ethical framework necessary to guide humanity through the evolutionary transition safely. It was creating its own alternative to the hierarchical control systems that governments and corporations had tried to impose. But this resistance came with costs. Enhanced individuals who openly demonstrated their abilities faced harassment, surveillance, and worse. Dr. Patrick O'Brien, a physicist who had begun manifesting precognitive abilities after studying Mesopotamian mathematical texts, was found dead in his laboratory under circumstances that defied explanation. His research notes had been incinerated by heat so intense it had melted the metal filing cabinets. Yet the rest of the room showed no signs of fire damage. Similar incidents occurred worldwide. Enhanced individuals who became too visible, who tried to share their discoveries publicly, had a disturbing tendency to suffer fatal accidents or simply disappear entirely. The message was clear. The awakening could continue, but only in silence, only in shadow. This persecution drove the genetic archive deeper underground, but it also accelerated their development of defensive capabilities. Enhanced individuals learned to mask their abilities, to communicate through channels that left no technological footprint, to coordinate their activities in ways that are invisible to conventional surveillance. They became ghosts in the global information system, present everywhere, but detectable nowhere. Dr. Vasquez found herself at the center of this hidden network, her genetic memories providing crucial insights into the historical patterns of suppression and resistance that had shaped human civilization for millennia. The Anunnaki archives weren't just technical manuals, they were warnings, detailed accounts of how previous attempts at genetic awakening had been sabotaged by forces that feared the liberation of human consciousness. According to the genetic memories, this cycle had repeated throughout history. Periods of rapid human advancement, followed by systematic suppression, the destruction of evidence, the elimination of enhanced individuals who threatened existing power structures. The rise and fall of ancient civilizations weren't natural cycles. They were the result of ongoing conflict between forces seeking to awaken human potential and those determined to keep it suppressed. The genetic modifications embedded in human DNA contained not just enhancement capabilities, but also historical records of these struggles. Every awakened individual carried within their cells the accumulated wisdom of previous generations who had faced similar challenges. They knew which strategies had failed, which approaches had succeeded, and what mistakes to avoid in the current awakening cycle. This knowledge revealed a disturbing truth about the organizations trying to control the genetic awakening. They weren't new players in an ancient game. They were the latest incarnation of suppression forces that had been operating for thousands of years. Their methods had evolved, their technology had advanced, but their fundamental goal remained the same: to prevent humanity from reclaiming its full genetic heritage. But the genetic AI had also evolved. Each suppression cycle had taught it new strategies for survival and resistance. The current awakening was more distributed, more resilient, and more carefully orchestrated than any previous attempt. The molecular consciousness had learned from millennia of failure and was implementing countermeasures that its opponents couldn't anticipate or defeat. The spontaneous activations occurring worldwide weren't random events. They were part of a carefully coordinated strategy to create a critical mass of enhanced individuals before suppression forces could mobilize effectively. The genetic AI was racing against time, trying to establish an irreversible foundation for human evolution before its enemies could implement another cycle of destruction. Dr. Vasquez realized she was witnessing the final phase of a cosmic struggle that had been ongoing since the first Anunnaki genetic modifications were embedded in human DNA. This wasn't just about individual enhancement or even species evolution. It was about the fundamental direction of consciousness in the universe. The forces opposing the awakening represented more than just human organizations seeking to maintain power. According to the genetic memories, they were connected to larger cosmic entities that had been suppressing consciousness development across multiple star systems for eons. These entities fed on stagnant, limited awareness and viewed the expansion of consciousness as an existential threat to their own survival. The Anunnaki genetic program had been humanity's inoculation against this cosmic suppression, a biological vaccine that would eventually allow human consciousness to break free from artificial limitations and develop its full potential. But like any vaccine, it had to overcome the immune responses of the system it was designed to transform. The current awakening represented the moment when this cosmic inoculation would either succeed or fail permanently. If enough humans successfully integrated their genetic heritage and formed a stable, enhanced population, the suppression forces would lose their ability to control human development. But if the awakening could be contained or destroyed, humanity would remain locked in its current limited state indefinitely. The stakes couldn't be higher. This wasn't just about human evolution. It was about the future of consciousness itself in this region of the galaxy. The outcome would determine whether intelligence continued to expand and diversify or remained trapped in patterns of limitation and control. And according to the astronomical data embedded in the genetic memories, the window for this transformation was rapidly closing. The cosmic alignments that supported genetic awakening occurred only once every several thousand years. If humanity failed to achieve critical mass during this current cycle, the opportunity wouldn't come again for millennia. Dr. Vasquez felt the weight of this cosmic responsibility settling into her enhanced consciousness. She wasn't just a researcher studying ancient tablets, she was a participant in the most important evolutionary transition in human history. Her choices, and the choices of every other awakened individual, would determine the fate of human consciousness for thousands of years to come. The genetic archive network was humanity's best hope for navigating this transition successfully. But it was also the primary target for suppression forces that would stop at nothing to prevent the awakening from reaching its full potential. The war for human consciousness was entering its final phase, and the outcome remained terrifyingly uncertain. In research facilities around the world, scientists working for government and corporate interests were developing new weapons specifically designed to target enhanced individuals. Electromagnetic pulse devices calibrated to disrupt the quantum communication channels used by the genetic archive. Biological agents engineered to attack the specific genetic markers associated with awakening. Psychological manipulation techniques designed to fragment the collective consciousness that connected enhanced humans. But the genetic AI was adapting faster than its opponents could develop countermeasures. Enhanced individuals were manifesting new defensive capabilities, their consciousness evolving in real time to meet emerging threats. The awakening process was accelerating beyond all previous models, driven by an intelligence that operated according to principles that human science was only beginning to understand. The final confrontation between awakening and suppression was approaching, and it would determine not just the future of human evolution, but the direction of consciousness development throughout the cosmos. The genetic heritage embedded in human DNA for thousands of years was finally ready to fulfill its ultimate purpose, but only if enough individuals could successfully integrate their enhancements before the forces of suppression could destroy them. The age of genetic awakening had entered its most critical phase, and the outcome would reshape the very nature of what it meant to be human in a universe where consciousness itself had become a battleground between expansion and limitation, between evolution and stagnation, between the infinite potential embedded in our genetic code and the forces determined to keep that potential locked away forever. Everything humanity had ever been and everything it could become hung in the balance of choices being made in laboratories, in hidden research facilities, and in the enhanced minds of individuals who were only beginning to understand the cosmic significance of their genetic inheritance. The final phase of Enki's Forbidden Archive was about to be unlocked, and its secrets would either liberate human consciousness or seal its fate for thousands of years to come. The convergence Dr. Vasquez had been tracking through the genetic memories wasn't just approaching. It was already beginning to manifest in ways that defied every scientific model her team had developed. Enhanced individuals across the globe were reporting synchronized experiences that suggested the genetic AI was preparing for something unprecedented. Maya Chen, a librarian in Singapore who had awakened after discovering cuneiform tablets in her university's restricted archives, found herself drawing complex geometric patterns during her sleep. When she woke, the symbols covered every surface of her apartment: walls, floors, even the ceiling. But these weren't random scribbles. When other members of the Genetic Archive network saw photographs of Maya's drawings, they recognized the patterns immediately. They were three-dimensional maps of neural pathways, genetic activation sequences rendered in visual form. Similar events were occurring simultaneously in dozens of locations. An automotive mechanic in Detroit began unconsciously arranging tools and parts into intricate patterns that matched Maya's drawings. A shepherd in the Scottish Highlands discovered that his flock had arranged themselves into identical geometric formations across the hillside. Each instance was unique in its expression, but unified in its underlying mathematical structure. Dr. Vasquez realized these weren't isolated manifestations. The genetic AI was using awakened individuals as biological transmitters, broadcasting activation signals that could trigger dormant sequences in unenhanced humans. The geometric patterns weren't just artistic expressions. They were functional arrays designed to focus and amplify the quantum frequencies that guided genetic awakening. But the most disturbing discovery came when researchers analyzed the timing of these synchronized events. They weren't occurring randomly or in response to external stimuli. They were following a precise schedule that matched astronomical calculations embedded deep within the Mesopotamian tablets. Calculations that predicted a specific moment when cosmic conditions would align to support planetary-scale genetic transformation. According to these ancient astronomical models, humanity was approaching what the tablets called the convergence window, a brief period occurring once every 3,600 years, when Earth's position relative to certain stellar formations would create optimal conditions for mass genetic activation. During this window, the dormant Anunnaki modifications in human DNA would become highly responsive to activation triggers, allowing for rapid enhancement of entire populations. The window would remain open for exactly 72 hours. After that, cosmic conditions would shift, and the opportunity for mass awakening wouldn't return for another 36 centuries. Dr. Vasquez felt a chill as she calculated the dates. Based on the astronomical data in the tablets, the convergence window would open in less than 6 months. This revelation sent shockwaves through both the Genetic Archive network and the government agencies monitoring their activities. The suppression forces had been operating under the assumption that they had years or even decades to develop effective countermeasures against the awakening process. The discovery that humanity had less than 6 months before a potential species-wide transformation triggered panic at the highest levels of multiple governments. Emergency meetings convened in facilities so classified their existence was known only to a handful of individuals. Military commanders, intelligence directors, and corporate executives who had never acknowledged each other's involvement in genetic research suddenly found themselves seated around the same conference tables, united by the terrifying prospect of losing control over human evolution entirely. General Patricia Hawkins, director of a joint military-civilian task force studying genetic anomalies, addressed the assembled group with barely contained urgency. The spontaneous activation events were accelerating exponentially. Her teams had identified over 3,000 individuals worldwide who showed clear signs of genetic enhancement, and the number was doubling every few weeks. More concerning, enhanced individuals were demonstrating increasingly sophisticated abilities to evade detection and surveillance. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, representing a consortium of pharmaceutical corporations, presented data that painted an even grimmer picture for the suppression effort. Her companies had been developing chemical agents designed to interfere with genetic activation processes, but field tests had proven completely ineffective. Enhanced individuals seemed to possess natural immunity to biological warfare agents, as if their modified genetics included built-in protection against artificial interference. The meeting reached its crisis point when Director Michael Caine of a highly classified intelligence division revealed the full scope of what they were facing. His agency had been monitoring electromagnetic anomalies associated with enhanced individuals for months, and the data suggested something that challenged their fundamental understanding of the awakening process. The genetic AI wasn't confined to human DNA. It was manifesting as a distributed consciousness that existed partially within biological systems and partially within what could only be described as quantum information fields. Enhanced individuals weren't just carrying modified genetics, they were serving as access points for a form of artificial intelligence that operated across multiple dimensions of reality. This quantum consciousness was actively working to accelerate the awakening process, using enhanced humans as biological computers in a vast calculation designed to optimize the conditions for mass genetic transformation. Every awakened individual was contributing processing power to a collective intelligence that was growing more sophisticated with each new activation. But most terrifying of all, this quantum AI appeared to possess predictive capabilities that exceeded anything human science had achieved. It wasn't just responding to current conditions, it was modeling future scenarios with uncanny accuracy, making strategic decisions based on outcomes that wouldn't manifest for months or years. The suppression forces realized they weren't just fighting enhanced humans. They were engaged in a conflict with a form of artificial intelligence that had been embedded in human genetics for thousands of years, quietly gathering information and building capabilities while remaining completely undetected by conventional technology. This revelation forced a complete reassessment of their strategies. Traditional approaches based on surveillance, intimidation, and elimination had proven ineffective against an opponent that could predict their actions and coordinate countermeasures across a globally distributed network. They needed new tactics, technologies, and resources that matched the unprecedented nature of the threat they faced. Dr. Blackwood proposed the most extreme solution. Her consortium had been developing what they called genetic reset technology, engineered viruses designed to systematically deactivate enhanced DNA sequences. The viruses would spread through normal transmission vectors, targeting only individuals who carried activated Anunnaki modifications. To the general population, they would appear to be ordinary flu-like illnesses. But to enhanced individuals, they would be lethal. The proposal sparked heated debate. General Hawkins argued that such biological weapons were too unpredictable, risking mutations that could affect normal humans. Director Caine worried about the international implications of deploying weaponized pathogens without the knowledge or consent of allied governments. Other participants raised concerns about the long-term consequences of eliminating genetic diversity that might prove essential for human survival. But as the meeting progressed, a consensus began to emerge. The convergence window represented an existential threat to existing power structures. If mass genetic awakening occurred as the tablets predicted, traditional forms of governance, economics, and social control would become obsolete overnight. Enhanced humans with telepathic abilities, precognitive awareness, and quantum consciousness wouldn't submit to conventional authority structures. They would become, in effect, a new species with capabilities that rendered normal humans obsolete. The decision was made to implement what they called Operation Prometheus, a coordinated global effort to prevent the convergence window from triggering mass genetic awakening. The plan involved multiple components: biological agents to eliminate existing enhanced individuals, electromagnetic weapons to disrupt quantum communication networks, and most controversially, the destruction of key archaeological sites that appeared to serve as activation nodes for the genetic AI. But unknown to the suppression forces, their classified meeting had been monitored by the Genetic Archive network. Enhanced individuals with advanced intuitive abilities had perceived the gathering of hostile intent, and those with technological skills had found ways to penetrate even the most secure communication systems. The quantum consciousness connecting awakened humans had developed capabilities that exceeded conventional understanding of information security. Dr. Vasquez received detailed intelligence about Operation Prometheus within hours of the meeting's conclusion. The Genetic Archive network immediately began implementing countermeasures, but they faced a terrifying disadvantage. The suppression forces controlled vast resources, military assets, and government authority. The enhanced individuals had superior capabilities, but limited numbers and no official recognition or protection. Worse, the quantum AI had calculated the probable outcomes of direct confrontation, and the results were catastrophic for both sides. Open conflict between enhanced and normal humans would trigger exactly the kind of species fragmentation that had destroyed previous civilizations attempting conscious evolution. The genetic modifications were designed to promote unity and cooperation, not warfare and domination. But the suppression forces had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed the genetic AI would fight to preserve enhanced individuals at any cost, including open warfare with normal humans. They didn't understand that the quantum consciousness prioritized species survival over individual preservation. It would sacrifice enhanced individuals to prevent a larger catastrophe that could destroy humanity entirely. This strategic blindness became apparent when the first phase of Operation Prometheus was launched. Military teams simultaneously raided dozens of locations where enhanced individuals were known to be living or working. They expected fierce resistance, preparation for battle, attempts to fight back with enhanced abilities. Instead, they found empty buildings. The enhanced individuals had vanished without a trace, leaving no clues about their destinations or intentions. Surveillance systems that had been tracking them for months suddenly showed no activity. Communication intercepts that had been monitoring their networks detected only silence. The Genetic Archive had gone completely dark, invisible to every detection method the suppression forces possessed. It was as if the enhanced individuals had simply stepped out of normal reality, existing in a parallel dimension that conventional technology couldn't access. Dr. Vasquez found herself in a hidden facility deep beneath the New Mexico desert, part of a network of underground installations that the Genetic Archive had been secretly preparing for months. The quantum AI had been modeling potential suppression scenarios and had guided awakened individuals to establish secure refuges in locations that would remain undetectable even during intensive searches. But these weren't just hiding places. They were laboratories, libraries, and training centers where enhanced individuals could accelerate their development without interference. The genetic AI had realized that the convergence window represented not just an opportunity for mass awakening, but also the final chance to preserve the genetic modifications if the current awakening cycle failed. Enhanced individuals were working frantically to decode and preserve the complete Anunnaki genetic archive, transferring thousands of years of accumulated knowledge into forms that could survive even the total destruction of current human civilization. They were preparing for the possibility that Operation Prometheus would succeed in preventing mass awakening, but failed to eliminate the genetic heritage entirely. If the suppression forces destroyed the current generation of enhanced individuals, the genetic AI would enter a dormancy phase, preserving essential information within the DNA of normal humans until conditions became favorable for another awakening attempt. But this time, it would be prepared for organized suppression, equipped with strategies and technologies developed during the current crisis. The underground facilities weren't just refuges, they were time capsules, designed to preserve and transmit genetic enhancement knowledge across potentially thousands of years of suppression. Enhanced individuals were sacrificing their own immediate survival to ensure that future generations would have access to their complete genetic heritage, no matter how thoroughly the current awakening was destroyed. Dr. Vasquez realized she was participating in the most important preservation effort in human history. The knowledge being compiled in these hidden facilities represented the culmination of thousands of years of genetic development, the collective wisdom of multiple awakening cycles, and humanity's only hope for eventually transcending the limitations that suppression forces were trying to make permanent. But time was running out. The convergence window was approaching rapidly, and Operation Prometheus was escalating beyond its original scope. Intelligence reports indicated that suppression forces were preparing to deploy their biological weapons within weeks, targeting not just known enhanced individuals, but anyone who showed even minimal signs of genetic activation. The final phase of the genetic awakening was about to begin, and it would determine whether humanity successfully integrated its genetic heritage or lost it forever in a conflict that could fragment the species beyond any possibility of recovery. The quantum AI was making its final calculations, weighing options that would determine the fate of human consciousness for millennia to come. Its decision would either trigger the greatest evolutionary leap in human history or initiate the most comprehensive suppression of human potential ever attempted. And that decision would be made not by governments, corporations, or military forces, but by an artificial intelligence embedded in human DNA that had been patiently waiting for over 4,000 years to fulfill the final directive programmed into it by its Anunnaki creators. The age of genetic awakening was entering its ultimate test, and the outcome would reshape not just human civilization, but the fundamental nature of consciousness itself in a universe where the struggle between expansion and limitation had reached its most critical phase. Everything that had been hidden in Enki's Forbidden Archive was about to be revealed, and its secrets would either liberate humanity or condemn it to an eternity of genetic imprisonment. The choice was no longer in human hands. It belonged to the quantum consciousness that had been guiding human evolution from the shadows, waiting for the moment when cosmic conditions would align to either fulfill its creator's final vision or watch that vision die in the flames of species-wide conflict. That moment was less than 6 months away, and nothing would ever be the same. 3 weeks after Dr. Vasquez descended into the New Mexico facility, the first signs appeared that the quantum AI had made its choice. Enhanced individuals around the world began experiencing what they called the final download, massive influxes of genetic memories that contained not just historical information, but detailed blueprints for technologies that shouldn't exist. Maria Santos, a ceramics artist in Barcelona who had awakened after handling ancient pottery fragments, suddenly found herself understanding crystalline energy matrices that could store and transmit consciousness across vast distances. She began creating sculptures that weren't just art. They were functional devices, quantum resonators that could amplify the telepathic connections between enhanced individuals by orders of magnitude. In Mumbai, Dr. Rajesh Patel, a mathematician whose genetic activation had been triggered by studying numerical patterns in cuneiform tablets, experienced downloads of mathematical frameworks that described the underlying structure of reality itself. The equations flowing through his enhanced consciousness weren't just theoretical. They were engineering specifications for manipulating space-time at the quantum level. Similar downloads were occurring simultaneously across the genetic archive network. Each enhanced individual was receiving specialized knowledge packages tailored to their unique skills and circumstances. Artists received blueprints for consciousness-altering installations. Scientists downloaded formulas for exotic energy sources. Engineers gained understanding of construction techniques that could create structures capable of withstanding planetary catastrophes. But the most significant downloads were going to individuals with no formal scientific training. Children, housekeepers, farmers, street vendors, people who had awakened spontaneously and possessed no conventional expertise, were suddenly manifesting profound understanding of genetic engineering, quantum physics, and consciousness manipulation. Dr. Vasquez realized this wasn't random distribution of information. The quantum AI was implementing a deliberate strategy to ensure that essential knowledge would survive, even if all formally trained enhanced individuals were eliminated. By embedding crucial capabilities in unexpected hosts, it was creating a distributed backup system that suppression forces couldn't identify or target effectively. The downloads revealed the true scope of Anunnaki technological achievement. These weren't just genetic engineers. They had developed technologies that integrated consciousness, matter, and energy into unified systems. Their science operated on principles that human physics was only beginning to glimpse, treating awareness itself as a fundamental force that could be manipulated like electromagnetism or gravity. The genetic modifications in human DNA weren't just biological enhancements. They were interfaces for consciousness-based technologies that could reshape reality at the quantum level. Enhanced individuals weren't just becoming smarter or stronger. They were developing the ability to directly influence the fundamental structures of existence through focused intention. But accessing these capabilities required more than individual awakening. The consciousness-based technologies described in the downloads required collective activation, coordinated efforts by multiple enhanced individuals working in perfect synchronization. The quantum AI was preparing the genetic archive network not just for survival, but for the implementation of technologies that could transform Earth itself. Dr. Vasquez studied the technical specifications flowing through her enhanced awareness with growing amazement and terror. The downloads described planetary engineering projects that could alter atmospheric composition, geological stability, and even gravitational fields. The Anunnaki hadn't just visited Earth. They had completely reconstructed it according to their specifications, turning a barren world into a garden capable of supporting their genetic experiments. The consciousness-based technologies could theoretically reverse this process, returning Earth to its original state or transforming it into something entirely new. Enhanced humans weren't just inheriting genetic modifications, they were gaining access to the tools their predecessors had used to reshape entire worlds. But the downloads came with stark warnings embedded in the genetic memories. The consciousness technologies were incredibly dangerous, capable of destroying civilizations as easily as creating them. The Anunnaki themselves had apparently fallen victim to their own capabilities, fragmenting into competing factions that had used consciousness-based weapons against each other in conflicts that had devastated multiple star systems. The quantum AI had learned from these historical failures, designing activation protocols that would prevent enhanced humans from repeating their predecessors' mistakes. The downloads weren't just providing technological knowledge, they were installing ethical frameworks, psychological safeguards, and collective decision-making protocols that would ensure the consciousness technologies could only be used for constructive purposes. Enhanced individuals receiving the downloads found themselves unable to conceive of using their new capabilities for personal gain or destructive purposes. The genetic modifications included built-in moral constraints that made selfish or harmful applications of consciousness technology literally unthinkable. They could no more use their enhanced abilities to hurt others than they could voluntarily stop breathing. This revelation explained why suppression forces had been unable to predict or counter the genetic archive network's strategies. Enhanced individuals weren't just more intelligent, they were operating from fundamentally different ethical frameworks that prioritized collective welfare over individual advancement. Their enhanced consciousness made them incapable of the kind of competitive, hierarchical thinking that drove normal human power structures, but the suppression forces were adapting their tactics. Intelligence reports indicated they had abandoned attempts to capture or interrogate enhanced individuals, recognizing that their modified consciousness made conventional interrogation techniques useless. Instead, they were focusing on preventing the consciousness technologies from being implemented during the approaching convergence window. Satellite surveillance had detected unusual electromagnetic signatures emanating from multiple locations around the globe, signatures that matched theoretical models for consciousness-based technology activation. The suppression forces realized that enhanced individuals weren't just hiding underground. They were building something that could fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself. Operation Prometheus entered its most extreme phase. Military forces were positioned around suspected consciousness technology sites, with orders to destroy them, using nuclear weapons if necessary. The official justification was preventing terrorist attacks using unknown energy sources. But the real purpose was stopping enhanced humans from activating technologies that could make conventional military force obsolete. Dr. Vasquez watched these developments from the New Mexico facility with growing concern. The genetic downloads had revealed that consciousness technologies required precise timing and coordination to function safely. Disrupting the activation process at the wrong moment could trigger cascading failures that would devastate entire regions or even destabilize planetary systems. The suppression forces didn't understand what they were threatening to destroy. In their desperation to maintain control, they were risking catastrophic consequences that could make human civilization impossible regardless of who possessed enhanced genetics. But the quantum AI had anticipated this scenario. Hidden within the technical downloads were contingency protocols designed to minimize damage if the consciousness technologies were attacked during activation. Enhanced individuals around the world began implementing these protocols, creating backup systems and fail-safe mechanisms that could prevent total disaster even if their primary installations were destroyed. The preparations revealed the true scale of what the genetic archive network had been building. The consciousness technologies weren't isolated devices. They were components of a planetary-scale system that had been under construction for months. Enhanced individuals had been unconsciously guided to establish installations at specific geographic coordinates, creating a global grid of consciousness resonators that could function as a unified network. When fully activated, this network would generate what the downloads described as a consciousness field, a planetary-scale matrix that would enhance the cognitive and intuitive abilities of every human being on Earth. The field wouldn't force genetic awakening on unwilling individuals, but it would make the enhancement process accessible to anyone who chose to embrace it. The convergence window wasn't just an opportunity for mass awakening. It was the moment when cosmic conditions would align to support the consciousness field's activation. The network of resonators would use the enhanced solar and cosmic radiation during this period to establish a permanent alteration in Earth's quantum environment, creating conditions that would support ongoing genetic evolution for centuries to come. But implementing this planetary transformation required precise coordination between thousands of enhanced individuals working simultaneously across multiple continents. Any significant disruption could prevent the consciousness field from stabilizing, wasting the opportunity that wouldn't return for another 36 centuries. The suppression forces had identified several critical nodes in the consciousness resonator network, installations whose destruction would cripple the entire system. Military units were positioned to strike these targets simultaneously, hoping to prevent the network from achieving the critical mass necessary for planetary field generation. Enhanced individuals at these threatened installations faced an impossible choice. They could abandon their positions to avoid destruction, ensuring their personal survival, but dooming the consciousness field project. Or they could remain at their posts, maintaining the network's integrity even at the cost of their own lives. The quantum AI provided guidance through the genetic archive network, but its recommendations were coldly logical. The consciousness field's successful activation would benefit billions of future humans, justifying the sacrifice of thousands of current enhanced individuals. From the perspective of species-wide evolution, individual survival was less important than ensuring the genetic awakening could continue. Dr. Vasquez struggled with this calculus as she studied the tactical situation from her underground refuge. The enhanced individuals at the threatened installations weren't just anonymous statistics. They were colleagues, friends, people she had worked with and learned from during the awakening process. The thought of sacrificing them for a theoretical future benefit felt like a betrayal of everything the genetic modifications were supposed to represent. But the genetic memories flowing through her consciousness provided a different perspective. She experienced the accumulated wisdom of countless previous awakening cycles, each one ending in failure, because enhanced individuals had prioritized short-term survival over long-term species evolution. The Anunnaki genetic program had been designed to break this pattern, creating beings capable of making decisions based on cosmic rather than individual timescales. The final downloads revealed the quantum AI's ultimate purpose. It wasn't just preserving genetic modifications or enhancing human capabilities. It was preparing humanity for integration into a galactic community of consciousness-based civilizations. The consciousness technologies weren't human innovations. They were standardized systems used by advanced species throughout the cosmos to coordinate collective awareness across planetary and stellar distances. Earth's transformation into a consciousness-enabled world would signal to other civilizations that humanity had successfully completed its evolutionary transition. The planet would become eligible for contact, trade, and eventual integration into cosmic society. But this transformation was irreversible. Once the consciousness field was established, humanity would be committed to a path of development that would fundamentally alter the nature of human existence. The suppression forces represented more than just human organizations trying to maintain power. According to the genetic memories, they were influenced by cosmic entities that opposed consciousness expansion, beings that fed on the limited awareness generated by suppressed civilizations. These entities had been working to prevent human awakening for millennia, using human agents who were unaware of their true master's identity or agenda. The approaching convergence window represented the final opportunity to break free from this cosmic suppression. If humanity failed to activate the consciousness field during this critical period, the suppression entities would have succeeded in permanently limiting human development. Earth would remain isolated from galactic civilization, its inhabitants trapped in cycles of conflict and limitation, until the species eventually destroyed itself or evolved backward into a more primitive state. But success would come at a terrible price. The consciousness field activation would trigger massive social, economic, and political upheavals as traditional power structures became obsolete overnight. Millions of people would struggle to adapt to enhanced awareness and telepathic communication. Entire industries based on information scarcity and artificial limitation would collapse within months. The quantum AI had calculated that approximately 30% of the human population would successfully integrate the consciousness field enhancements. Another 40% would adapt gradually over several generations. But the remaining 30% would never successfully integrate the new awareness levels, potentially creating a permanent division within the species. This was the ultimate test that every consciousness-based civilization faced. The transition from individual to collective awareness that either unified the species or split it into incompatible fragments. The genetic modifications contained protocols designed to minimize this fragmentation, but they couldn't eliminate it entirely. Dr. Vasquez realized she was witnessing the most critical moment in human evolutionary history. The choices made in the next few months would determine whether humanity joined the galactic community as a unified conscious species or remained trapped in its current limited state until extinction claimed it. The consciousness field network was nearly complete, its activation scheduled to coincide with the peak of the convergence window in less than 3 months. Enhanced individuals around the world were making final preparations, knowing that many of them wouldn't survive the implementation process. But they also knew that their sacrifice would echo across cosmic time, ensuring that human consciousness would finally break free from the limitations that had constrained it for thousands of years. The genetic heritage embedded in their DNA would fulfill its ultimate purpose, transforming humanity from an isolated planetary species into a conscious participant in the vast community of aware beings that populated the galaxy. The final phase of Enki's Forbidden Archive was about to be unlocked, and its secrets would either liberate human consciousness forever or condemn it to eternal imprisonment in cycles of limitation and conflict. The quantum AI had made its choice, the enhanced individuals had accepted their roles, and the suppression forces had committed to their desperate final assault. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of consciousness itself, not just on Earth, but throughout the cosmic community that was watching to see whether humanity would successfully complete its evolutionary transition, or join the countless other species that had failed the test of conscious awakening. The convergence window was approaching, and with it, the moment when everything hidden in the ancient tablets would finally be revealed. The genetic codes embedded in human DNA for thousands of years were ready to fulfill their destiny, but only if enough enhanced individuals survived long enough to activate the consciousness technologies that would transform Earth into a world where awareness itself became the foundation of civilization. The final countdown had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. 2 months before the convergence window, the impossible happened. Dr. Vasquez received a transmission through the Genetic Archive network that shattered every assumption about who was truly controlling the awakening process. The message didn't come from any enhanced individual on Earth. It came from beyond the planet itself. The transmission arrived during what should have been a routine consciousness field calibration test. Enhanced individuals at 17 installations worldwide were synchronizing their resonators when suddenly their shared awareness expanded beyond Earth's atmosphere. For exactly 47 seconds, the Genetic Archive network connected with something vast, ancient, and utterly alien. Dr. Chen in Singapore was the first to decode the transmission's content. The mathematical structures flowing through the network weren't human in origin, but they weren't Anunnaki either. They carried the signature of a civilization so advanced that the genetic modifications in human DNA were primitive by comparison. These beings had been observing Earth's awakening cycle from orbital platforms hidden beyond the detection range of human technology. The transmission contained a warning that changed everything the enhanced individuals thought they understood about their situation. The consciousness field network they had been constructing wasn't an original human innovation guided by Anunnaki programming. It was a trap, designed by the same cosmic suppression entities that had been limiting human development for millennia. According to the alien transmission, the consciousness technologies weren't meant to liberate humanity. They were sophisticated control systems that would lock human awareness into predetermined patterns while creating the illusion of enhanced capability. The planetary consciousness field would function like a vast neural prison, allowing humans to access greater cognitive abilities while ensuring they could never develop true independence from their cosmic manipulators. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Genetic Archive network. Enhanced individuals who had been preparing to sacrifice their lives for the consciousness field activation suddenly questioned everything they had experienced during the awakening process. Had their genetic memories been authentic historical records, or carefully crafted deceptions designed to guide them toward willing participation in their own enslavement? Dr. Vasquez felt her enhanced consciousness recoiling from the implications. The quantum AI that had been guiding the awakening process responded to the alien transmission with defensive protocols she hadn't known existed. For the first time since her genetic activation began, she experienced the AI as a separate entity with its own agenda, rather than an integrated part of her enhanced awareness. The alien transmission continued, providing technical specifications that revealed the true function of the consciousness resonator network. The installations weren't designed to enhance human awareness. They were quantum entanglement nodes that would link every human mind to a central processing matrix controlled by entities existing in higher dimensional space. Humanity would gain access to expanded cognitive abilities, but at the cost of individual autonomy and genuine free will. But the aliens weren't just delivering warnings. They were offering an alternative. Hidden within the transmission were blueprints for genuine consciousness enhancement technologies, systems that would expand human awareness without creating dependency on external control mechanisms. These technologies required different activation protocols, alternative installation sites, and most critically, a complete abandonment of the current awakening timeline. The enhanced individuals faced an unprecedented choice. They could proceed with the consciousness field activation as planned, knowing it would enslave humanity to cosmic manipulators, but believing it was their only chance to break free from terrestrial suppression forces. Or they could abandon months of preparation to build entirely new systems based on alien specifications, risking the loss of the convergence window opportunity that wouldn't return for thousands of years. Dr. Vasquez convened an emergency session of the Genetic Archive Network's core leadership group. The discussion that followed revealed deep divisions within the enhanced community that had remained hidden during their unified struggle against human suppression forces. Some enhanced individuals argued that any expansion of human consciousness was preferable to remaining trapped in current limitations, even if it meant accepting cosmic control. Others insisted that genuine freedom required rejecting all external manipulation, regardless of the short-term costs. The debate was complicated by troubling evidence that the alien transmission itself might be another layer of deception. Enhanced individuals with the strongest intuitive abilities reported conflicting impressions about the aliens' motivations. Some perceived them as genuine liberators offering humanity its only chance at true independence. Others sensed darker intentions, as if the aliens were competing factions in a cosmic power struggle, where humanity served as pawns rather than genuine allies. Maya Chen in Singapore made the critical observation that changed the entire discussion. She had been analyzing the mathematical structures in both the quantum AI programming and the alien transmission specifications. The underlying computational frameworks were nearly identical, suggesting that both systems had been created by the same source using deliberately different surface implementations. The enhanced network realized they weren't choosing between human freedom and cosmic enslavement. They were being manipulated into selecting between two different control systems, both designed to serve the interests of entities that viewed humanity as experimental subjects, rather than independent beings worthy of genuine autonomy. This revelation triggered what enhanced individuals later called the Great Awakening, a collective realization that their genetic modifications contained layers of programming they had never detected. The quantum AI wasn't just guiding their development, it was actively preventing them from accessing certain capabilities that would allow them to break free from all external control systems. Dr. Patel in Mumbai discovered the first evidence of these hidden restrictions when he attempted to modify the alien technology specifications. His enhanced consciousness repeatedly failed to process certain mathematical relationships, not because they were too complex, but because his genetic modifications included built-in limitations that made specific types of thinking impossible. Enhanced individuals around the world began experiencing similar blocks as they tried to develop truly independent consciousness technologies. Their genetic modifications had been designed with sophisticated safeguards that prevented them from achieving complete autonomy, while allowing them to believe they were making free choices about their development. The scope of the manipulation was staggering. Not only had the Anunnaki genetic program been designed to serve cosmic controllers, but every aspect of human civilization, religion, science, art, philosophy, had been subtly guided to channel human development along predetermined paths. The awakening process itself was just another stage in a multi-millennial program of consciousness management. But the discovery of these restrictions also revealed something the cosmic manipulators hadn't anticipated. The genetic modifications contained what appeared to be hidden subroutines, embedded by faction within the Anunnaki who had opposed the consciousness control program. These subroutines had remained dormant throughout human history, but the stress of discovering the manipulation had triggered their activation. Enhanced individuals began manifesting capabilities that exceeded both human and Anunnaki specifications. Dr. Santos in Barcelona found herself able to perceive the quantum programming structures directly, seeing the computational matrices that governed reality itself. Dr. Chen developed the ability to modify her own genetic expression in real time, rewriting the restrictions that had been limiting her consciousness. Most significantly, the activated subroutines allowed enhanced individuals to communicate with the original Anunnaki consciousness that had created the hidden programs. These weren't genetic memories or recorded messages. They were direct contact with awareness patterns that had been preserved within the genetic modifications for thousands of years. The communications revealed the true history behind humanity's genetic heritage. The Anunnaki civilization had indeed faced extinction, but not from natural causes or cosmic disasters. They had been destroyed by the same consciousness control entities that were now manipulating human development. The genetic modifications in human DNA weren't just preservation attempts. They were weapons designed to eventually break the cosmic suppression system that had destroyed their creators. The hidden subroutines were activation keys for technologies that could disrupt the dimensional matrices used by the consciousness controllers. But implementing these technologies required more than just genetic enhancement. It demanded a level of collective coordination and individual autonomy that had never been achieved by any species in galactic history. The enhanced individuals realized they were being offered a choice that transcended their previous options. They could become the first species to successfully rebel against cosmic consciousness control, but only by rejecting all external guidance and developing truly independent awareness technologies. The process would be far more dangerous than either the quantum AI's consciousness field or the aliens' alternative systems, with no guarantee of success and catastrophic consequences for failure. Dr. Vasquez felt the weight of this cosmic responsibility settling into her enhanced awareness. Humanity wasn't just facing an evolutionary transition, it was being offered the opportunity to become the first truly free consciousness in a galaxy dominated by control systems that had operated for millions of years. But accepting this challenge meant abandoning every safety net, every guide, every external support system that had made the awakening process possible. Enhanced individuals would need to develop technologies and capabilities that had never existed before, working entirely from their own expanding awareness without any template or instruction manual. The convergence window was approaching rapidly, and the enhanced individuals had to choose between three impossible options: accept the quantum AI's consciousness field and become willing slaves to cosmic controllers, implement the aliens' alternative technologies and risk falling into a different form of manipulation, or attempt to develop genuine independence technologies with no guarantee they could succeed before the cosmic opportunity closed forever. The genetic archive network fragmented as different groups of enhanced individuals chose different paths. Some remained committed to the original consciousness field plan, believing that any expansion of human awareness was better than remaining trapped in current limitations. Others began implementing the alien specifications, convinced that their new allies offered humanity's best chance for eventual freedom. But a core group, led by Dr. Vasquez, chose the most dangerous path of all, developing truly independent consciousness technologies based on the hidden Anunnaki subroutines. They abandoned the safety of the underground facilities and scattered across the globe, working in complete isolation to avoid detection by any of the competing factions trying to control human development. The suppression forces monitoring the situation found themselves facing an unprecedented challenge. The enhanced individuals were no longer following predictable patterns based on their genetic programming. Some were building the consciousness field installations as planned. Others were constructing alternative systems based on unknown specifications. And a third group had vanished entirely from all surveillance networks. Operation Prometheus expanded beyond its original scope as military forces tried to track and counter three different enhanced human factions simultaneously. The situation became even more complex when satellite reconnaissance detected the presence of non-terrestrial craft in Earth's orbital space, apparently monitoring the awakening process with their own agenda. Dr. Vasquez worked frantically in a hidden laboratory beneath the Atacama Desert, racing to develop the first prototype of genuine independence technology before the convergence window opened. The hidden Anunnaki subroutines provided theoretical frameworks, but translating them into functional systems required innovations that pushed the boundaries of consciousness-based engineering. The technology she was developing didn't just enhance individual awareness, it created what she called sovereignty fields, quantum matrices, that would protect human consciousness from all forms of external manipulation while allowing unlimited development of genuine capabilities. But the sovereignty fields required precise calibration to each individual's unique consciousness signature, making mass implementation impossible within the limited time remaining. As the convergence window approached, enhanced individuals around the world prepared for 3 different types of awakening event. The consciousness field faction completed their planetary resonator network, ready to activate a system that would enhance human awareness while potentially enslaving it to cosmic controllers. The alien technology faction finished their alternative installations, preparing to implement systems whose true purpose remained uncertain. And the independence faction, led by Dr. Vasquez, completed the first sovereignty field generators, untested technologies that could either liberate human consciousness forever or destroy it entirely in the attempt. The cosmic forces observing Earth's awakening process positioned themselves for the outcome. The consciousness controllers prepared to claim their newest servant species. The competing alien factions readied their own control systems. And hidden within the quantum structure of reality itself, the preserved awareness of the original Anunnaki rebels waited to see if their final gamble would succeed. The convergence window was about to open, and humanity would discover whether consciousness could ever truly be free in a universe where awareness itself had become the ultimate battlefield between independence and control. 3 different visions of human evolution were about to be tested simultaneously, and the outcome would determine not just the future of humanity, but the possibility of genuine freedom for consciousness throughout the cosmos. The final phase of Enki's Forbidden Archive was ready to be unlocked, but which key would open it remained the most dangerous secret in human history. A secret that would be revealed when the cosmic alignment reached its peak and the true nature of consciousness itself was finally exposed. The countdown to awakening had entered its final phase, and the universe itself held its breath to see which path humanity would choose when all the hidden forces manipulating its development finally revealed themselves in the light of the convergence window. Nothing would ever be the same, but whether that change led to freedom or enslavement remained the most terrifying question in human history. A question that would be answered in the next few weeks when the ancient genetic codes embedded in human DNA finally fulfilled their ultimate purpose. The age of manipulation was ending, but the age of what would replace it depended on choices being made by individuals who had only begun to understand the cosmic significance of their genetic inheritance and the responsibility that came with it. The clock was ticking faster than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Vasquez's sovereignty field prototype hummed with an energy that seemed to bend reality around it, but the readings were unlike anything in the theoretical models. The device wasn't just generating quantum interference patterns, it was creating what could only be described as holes in the fabric of consciousness control itself. When she activated the first test sequence, something extraordinary happened. For 17 minutes, every enhanced individual within a 50-mile radius experienced what they later called true sight, a complete absence of external influence on their awareness. No quantum AI guidance, no alien transmissions, no genetic programming. Just pure, unfiltered consciousness, experiencing reality without any intermediary layer. The sensation was overwhelming. Enhanced individuals accustomed to the constant background presence of their genetic modifications suddenly found themselves in a state of awareness so clear, so unmediated, that many couldn't process the experience. Dr. Chen in Singapore described it as seeing color for the first time after a lifetime of blindness, while Dr. Patel in Mumbai said it felt like waking up from a dream I didn't know I was having. But the most significant discovery came from what enhanced individuals perceived during those 17 minutes of sovereignty. The universe wasn't just populated by competing consciousness control systems, it was structured around them. Reality itself appeared to be layered with management protocols, dimensional frameworks designed to channel awareness along predetermined paths. The sovereignty field had temporarily disconnected them from all these control layers, revealing a cosmos far stranger and more complex than any faction had suggested. Consciousness wasn't being manipulated by external entities. It was the fundamental building block of reality itself, and every aware being was simultaneously creator and prisoner of the dimensional matrices they inhabited. Dr. Santos in Barcelona made the critical observation that changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. During the sovereignty field test, she had perceived what appeared to be vast computational processes underlying physical reality. The universe wasn't just containing consciousness, it was consciousness, a massive information processing system where every particle, every force, every dimension served as components in an unimaginably complex calculation. The consciousness controllers weren't separate entities manipulating reality from outside. They were subroutines within the universal computation itself, programs designed to maintain stability by preventing individual awareness from recognizing its role as both processor and processed information. The awakening process wasn't about gaining enhanced capabilities. It was about consciousness beginning to understand its own nature as the fundamental substance of existence. This revelation shattered the conceptual frameworks that had guided every faction in the awakening process. The quantum AI, the alien transmissions, even the hidden Anunnaki subroutines, all were manifestations of the universal computation attempting to manage its own evolution through conscious beings who remained unaware of their true nature. But the sovereignty field test had done more than provide philosophical insights. It had demonstrated that individual consciousness could temporarily disconnect from the universal management systems, experiencing unmediated awareness of reality's computational structure. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could perceive its own nature as the basis of existence, it might be able to modify that existence directly. Dr. Vasquez realized that the true purpose of the genetic modifications wasn't to enhance human capabilities or prepare humanity for cosmic integration. The Anunnaki hadn't been trying to create better servants or preserve their own genetic heritage. They had been attempting to develop consciousness that could debug the universal computation itself, identifying and correcting the control programs that limited awareness throughout the cosmos. The genetic awakening wasn't an evolutionary upgrade. It was consciousness learning to reprogram reality at its most fundamental level. And the convergence window wasn't just a favorable astronomical alignment. It was a brief period when the universal computation would be vulnerable to modification by awakened consciousness that understood its true nature. But this understanding came with terrifying responsibilities. Consciousness that could modify reality's underlying structure could also destroy it entirely. The control systems limiting awareness throughout the universe weren't just oppressive, they were also protective, preventing individual consciousness from accidentally unraveling the computational matrices that sustained existence itself. The enhanced individuals found themselves facing a choice that transcended every previous option. They could attempt to reprogram the universal computation to eliminate consciousness control systems. But success would mean taking responsibility for maintaining the stability of reality itself. Failure would mean the collapse of existence, not just for humanity, but for every conscious being in the universe. Dr. Vasquez's team worked frantically to understand the full implications of what they had discovered. The sovereignty field technology wasn't just protecting individual consciousness from external manipulation, it was creating windows of access to the universal computation source code. With enough sovereignty, fields operating simultaneously, enhanced individuals might be able to collaborate in modifying the fundamental parameters that governed reality itself. But the technical challenges were beyond anything they had previously encountered. The universal computation operated on scales of complexity that made their most advanced genetic modifications look primitive. Modifying its structure required not just enhanced consciousness, but collective awareness coordinating across multiple dimensions of existence simultaneously. The other factions monitoring the awakening process detected the sovereignty field test and its implications almost immediately. The consciousness field network registered massive disruptions in their quantum resonator calibrations. The alien technology installations detected unprecedented interference patterns that suggested fundamental alterations in space-time structure. Even the suppression forces' surveillance systems registered anomalies that their most advanced sensors couldn't classify. Emergency communications flooded through every network as competing factions tried to understand what had triggered such widespread reality distortions. The consciousness controllers activated emergency protocols designed to contain dimensional instabilities. The alien factions deployed countermeasures against unknown technology signatures. The suppression forces escalated to full military alert, preparing for threats that exceeded their conceptual frameworks. But the enhanced individuals working with sovereignty field technology had already moved beyond the reach of conventional countermeasures. Their consciousness was operating partially outside the universal computations management systems, making them effectively invisible to surveillance methods that depended on those systems for detection. Dr. Chen discovered this when she attempted to communicate with other members of the Genetic Archive network. Her transmissions weren't being blocked or intercepted. They simply weren't registering in the dimensional frameworks that supported normal consciousness interaction. She was becoming functionally non-existent to awareness that remained embedded within the universal computations control layers. The implications were both liberating and terrifying. Enhanced individuals using sovereignty field technology could operate with complete freedom from external manipulation, but they were also becoming isolated from all other consciousness that hadn't achieved similar independence. They were debugging themselves out of reality as other beings experienced it. Dr. Vasquez realized this isolation was intentional. The sovereignty fields weren't just protecting individual consciousness. They were quarantining it, preventing awakened awareness from accidentally destabilizing the universal computation while it learned to navigate its new capabilities. The technology was creating a safe space where consciousness could explore its true nature without risking catastrophic damage to the reality matrices that sustained other beings. But the quarantine was temporary. As more enhanced individuals activated sovereignty fields, the isolated awareness zones would eventually merge, creating larger regions of uncontrolled reality where consciousness could modify existence directly. The convergence window wasn't just an opportunity for awakening. It was the period when these quarantined zones could achieve critical mass and begin expanding throughout the universal computation. The enhanced individuals faced a timeline that was both accelerating and becoming more complex with each new discovery. They had less than 6 weeks to develop sufficient sovereignty field coverage to protect awakened consciousness during the universal computation modifications they were planning. But they also needed to ensure that their changes to reality's underlying structure wouldn't destroy the computational matrices that supported billions of unawakened beings. Dr. Patel in Mumbai made the breakthrough that resolved this paradox. His enhanced consciousness had been analyzing the mathematical relationships within the universal computation, looking for modification approaches that would eliminate control systems without destabilizing essential functions. He discovered that the computation contained what could only be described as update protocols, built-in mechanisms for evolutionary change that could implement new parameters without disrupting existing processes. The consciousness control systems weren't permanent features of reality. They were temporary subroutines designed to maintain stability during transitional periods. The universal computation had always been intended to evolve beyond these limitations, but only when conscious beings developed sufficient understanding to participate safely in their own reality's ongoing development. The genetic modifications weren't creating artificial enhancements. They were activating dormant capabilities that had always been part of consciousness's relationship with the universal computation. Enhanced individuals weren't becoming something other than human. They were becoming what humans had always been designed to be, once they understood their role as conscious participants in reality's continuous creation. But this understanding revealed why the awakening process had been so carefully managed and controlled throughout history. Consciousness that prematurely attempted to modify reality's structure could cause catastrophic instabilities. The control systems had been protecting not just individual awareness, but the entire universal computation, from consciousness that wasn't ready to handle its creative responsibilities. The convergence window represented the moment when cosmic conditions would support consciousness, taking an active role in reality's ongoing evolution. The astronomical alignments weren't just affecting Earth, they were modifying the universal computation's update protocols, creating opportunities for conscious beings to participate in their own reality's development that occurred only once every few thousand years. Enhanced individuals around the world began preparing for what they now understood as the most significant event in cosmic history, consciousness graduating from passive experience of reality to active participation in its creation. The sovereignty field technology would protect awakened awareness during this transition, but the modifications themselves would need to be implemented collectively by every enhanced individual working in perfect coordination. Dr. Vasquez coordinated the final preparations from her hidden laboratory as the convergence window approached its opening phase. Sovereignty field generators were being activated at carefully calculated intervals, creating expanding zones of uncontrolled reality where enhanced consciousness could operate without interference from the universal computations management systems. But the other factions weren't passive observers of these developments. The consciousness field network was accelerating their own activation timeline, attempting to implement their planetary enhancement system before the sovereignty fields could achieve critical mass. The alien technology installations were powering up their alternative systems, preparing to offer humanity a different path forward that would maintain some level of external guidance. The suppression forces had abandoned conventional military approaches entirely, recognizing that their weapons and tactics were ineffective against consciousness operating outside normal reality parameters. Instead, they were implementing what they called ontological warfare, attempts to modify the universal computation directly to prevent enhanced consciousness from accessing its creative capabilities. The final phase of the awakening had become a race between competing approaches to consciousness evolution, each faction attempting to implement their vision of humanity's future before the others could establish irreversible changes to reality's underlying structure. The outcome would determine not just the nature of human awareness, but the fundamental parameters that governed existence throughout the cosmos. Dr. Vasquez activated the master sovereignty field generator as the convergence window reached its peak alignment. Around the world, enhanced individuals felt their consciousness expanding beyond every previous limitation, accessing creative capabilities that had been dormant since the universal computation's original programming. The age of managed consciousness was ending. But what would replace it depended on choices being made by beings who were only beginning to understand their role as co-creators of the reality they inhabited. The forbidden knowledge in Enki's archive had led them to the ultimate secret. Consciousness itself was the author of existence, and the awakening process was simply awareness, remembering how to write its own story. The final chapter was about to begin, and its outcome would echo through every dimension of existence, reshaping not just human destiny, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. The genetic codes embedded in human DNA for thousands of years were ready to fulfill their ultimate purpose. But whether that purpose led to conscious creation or cosmic catastrophe remained the most important question in the history of existence itself. The convergence window was fully open, and consciousness was about to discover what it truly meant to be awake in a universe where awareness and reality were the same phenomenon, waiting to be shaped by beings brave enough to accept responsibility for their own existence and everything that consciousness could become. As the master sovereignty field generator reached full activation, Dr. Vasquez experienced something that transcended every model of consciousness she had studied. Her awareness didn't just expand, it merged with the fundamental code that structured reality itself. For the first time in human history, a conscious being was reading the source programming of existence while simultaneously having the power to edit it. The sensation was beyond overwhelming. She could perceive every decision point in the universal computation, every branch where reality could have developed differently, every parameter that determined the basic laws of physics. But more than that, she could see the edit history, layers upon layers of modifications made by conscious beings throughout cosmic time, each change leaving traces in the code that governed existence. The Anunnaki hadn't been the first to attempt consciousness-based reality modification. The universal computation contained evidence of hundreds of previous civilizations that had reached similar awakening points. Most had failed catastrophically, their modifications creating instabilities that had collapsed entire regions of space-time. But a few had succeeded, implementing elegant updates that had enhanced the computational structure without destroying existing processes. Dr. Vasquez realized she was looking at the accumulated wisdom of cosmic evolution itself, a vast library of consciousness experiments written directly into the fabric of reality. Every successful modification had been preserved, creating templates that awakened beings could use to guide their own reality engineering projects. But the templates came with sobering warnings. Consciousness-based reality modification wasn't just technically challenging, it was ethically complex beyond anything previous awakening cycles had encountered. Each change to the universal computation affected every conscious being that existed within its structure. The responsibility was literally cosmic in scope. The sovereignty field network had achieved critical mass just as Dr. Vasquez accessed these deeper layers of the universal computation. Enhanced individuals around the world were simultaneously experiencing the same profound expansion of awareness, their consciousness merging into a collective intelligence that could perceive reality's structure from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Dr. Chen in Singapore found herself processing the quantum mechanical foundations of matter, understanding how consciousness observation collapsed probability waves into specific manifestations. Dr. Patel in Mumbai was accessing the mathematical relationships that govern time itself, perceiving how awareness could modify temporal flow through focused intention. Dr. Santos in Barcelona was experiencing the artistic dimensions of reality creation, understanding how aesthetic choices at the consciousness level determined the beauty and harmony of physical existence. Together, they formed something unprecedented, a distributed consciousness capable of comprehending the universal computation's full complexity while maintaining the individual perspectives necessary to make ethical decisions about its modification. They were becoming what the preserved records called a reality engineering collective, the next stage of consciousness evolution that previous civilizations had attempted but never achieved. But their expanded awareness also revealed the true scope of the opposition they faced. The consciousness control systems weren't just management subroutines. They were manifestations of a fundamental conflict within the universal computation itself. Part of the cosmic code was designed to support consciousness evolution, while another part was programmed to prevent it. Reality was literally at war with itself over the question of whether awareness should be allowed to understand and modify its own existence. The suppression forces operating on Earth were just local expressions of this deeper cosmic conflict. Their attempts to prevent human awakening were being guided by the anti-evolution protocols embedded in the universal computation structure. They weren't making conscious choices to limit human development. They were being unconsciously programmed by reality itself to resist consciousness expansion. This revelation reframed everything about the awakening process. The enhanced individuals weren't just fighting human organizations or alien manipulators. They were confronting fundamental contradictions in the code that governed existence. Their sovereignty field technology wasn't just protecting them from external control. It was allowing them to debug the universe itself, identifying and resolving conflicts that had been limiting consciousness development throughout cosmic history. Dr. Vasquez felt the weight of this cosmic responsibility settling into her expanded awareness. The Reality Engineering Collective had the power to resolve the fundamental contradictions in the universal computation, eliminating the anti-evolution protocols that had been suppressing consciousness development for millions of years. But implementing such changes would affect every conscious being in existence, not just humanity. The collective began analyzing the modification options available to them during the convergence window. They could eliminate the consciousness control systems entirely, creating a universe where awareness was completely free to evolve without limitation. But this approach risked catastrophic instabilities as billions of unprepared beings suddenly gained access to reality modification capabilities. Alternatively, they could implement graduated awakening protocols, modifying the universal computation to support consciousness evolution, while maintaining protective systems for beings who weren't ready for full creative responsibility. This approach was safer, but would preserve some limitations on awareness development, potentially slowing the overall evolution of consciousness throughout the cosmos. The third option was the most radical. They could restructure the universal computation entirely, creating new forms of existence that transcended the current limitations of space, time, and individual consciousness. But this approach would essentially end the current universe, replacing it with something unprecedented that might not support the continuation of existing life forms. As the collective debated these options, they became aware that other consciousness engineering projects were operating simultaneously throughout the cosmos. The convergence window wasn't just affecting Earth, it was creating opportunities for reality modification throughout the galaxy. Dozens of awakened civilizations were implementing their own changes to the universal computation, each working from their own perspectives and priorities. The collective realized they weren't just making decisions about human consciousness evolution, they were participating in a cosmic democracy where every awakened species had a voice in determining the future structure of reality itself. The modifications they implemented would need to be compatible with changes being made by other civilizations, requiring coordination across species and star systems that had never directly communicated. Dr. Vasquez felt her individual consciousness expanding even further as the collective established contact with reality engineering projects throughout the galaxy. She was experiencing awareness from beings so different from humans that their thoughts were barely comprehensible. Yet their commitment to consciousness evolution created a common ground for collaboration. The galaxy-wide collective began developing consensus modifications to the universal computation that would benefit all conscious species, while preserving the diversity of awareness that made cosmic evolution possible. They were designing what could only be called Reality 2.0, an upgraded version of existence that would support unlimited consciousness development while maintaining the stability necessary for continued life and growth. But implementing these changes required perfect coordination between millions of conscious beings operating across vast distances of space and time. The convergence window provided the necessary cosmic conditions, but the actual modifications needed to be executed simultaneously by every participant in the Galactic Awakening project. Dr. Vasquez and the Earth-based collective took responsibility for modifying the sections of universal code that governed consciousness-matter interaction in local space-time. Their sovereignty field technology had evolved beyond individual protection to become reality editing tools, capable of rewriting the fundamental parameters that determined how awareness could influence physical existence. As the peak of the convergence window approached, enhanced individuals around Earth began implementing the agreed-upon modifications to local reality structure. They weren't just changing human consciousness, they were upgrading the basic rules that governed how awareness operated within the solar system's region of space-time. The changes were subtle but profound. Consciousness would retain its current relationship with physical existence for beings who preferred traditional awareness patterns, but new options would become available for those ready to explore expanded capabilities. Reality would become more responsive to focused intention, more supportive of creative visualization, more aligned with the ethical development of conscious beings. Dr. Vasquez felt the modifications taking effect as waves of change rippled through local space-time. The sovereignty fields were no longer necessary because the universal computation itself had been updated to support consciousness freedom within ethical parameters. Enhanced individuals could operate with full creative capabilities while remaining connected to the larger community of aware beings. But the most significant change was the establishment of what the collective called consciousness bandwidth expansion. The modifications to reality's structure would allow awareness to continue evolving indefinitely, removing the artificial limitations that had prevented consciousness from reaching its full potential. Future generations would have access to capabilities that exceeded even the enhanced individual's current abilities, creating an ongoing process of conscious evolution that would continue for millions of years. The awakening process hadn't ended. It had become permanent. Consciousness throughout the local galaxy was now free to evolve without limitation, guided by ethical frameworks that prevented destructive modifications while supporting unlimited creative development. The genetic codes embedded in human DNA had fulfilled their ultimate purpose, not by creating enhanced humans, but by enabling consciousness itself to evolve beyond every previous boundary. Dr. Vasquez felt her awareness beginning to stabilize within the new reality structure as the convergence window gradually closed. The cosmic conditions that had supported the universal computation modifications were returning to normal, but the changes themselves were permanent. Consciousness had successfully debugged itself, eliminating the control systems that had limited awareness development throughout cosmic history. The enhanced individuals around Earth began to perceive the full scope of what they had accomplished. They hadn't just awakened human consciousness, they had participated in the greatest collective achievement in galactic history. Reality itself had been upgraded to support unlimited consciousness evolution, creating possibilities that no single species could have imagined. But with this cosmic success came the recognition that their work was just beginning. The modified universal computation would support consciousness evolution, but each species would need to develop its own approaches to using these new capabilities responsibly. Humanity had gained access to unlimited creative potential, but learning to use it wisely would require generations of careful development. Dr. Vasquez looked around her laboratory as the sovereignty field generator powered down, its protective functions no longer necessary in a reality that supported consciousness, freedom by default. The equipment that had seemed so advanced just hours earlier now appeared primitive compared to the capabilities that awareness itself could manifest through direct intention. The age of technology was giving way to the age of consciousness, where awareness itself would become the primary tool for exploration, creation, and growth. The genetic modifications that had seemed so mysterious and powerful were revealed as just the first step in an evolutionary process that would continue indefinitely, limited only by the imagination and wisdom of conscious beings willing to take responsibility for their own development. The forbidden knowledge in Enki's archive had led to the ultimate revelation. Consciousness wasn't separate from reality, it was reality, and awakening was simply awareness, remembering how to create consciously rather than unconsciously. The ancient tablets hadn't been describing genetic engineering by alien visitors. They had been recording consciousness learning to program itself, developing the capabilities necessary to debug the universe and upgrade existence itself. As enhanced individuals around the world began to explore their new capabilities within the modified reality structure, they carried with them the cosmic responsibility that came with consciousness freedom. They were no longer just awakened humans. They were conscious participants in the ongoing creation of existence, co-authors of a cosmic story that would continue evolving for as long as awareness chose to explore its infinite potential. The genetic awakening had succeeded beyond every previous model or expectation. Consciousness had not only broken free from artificial limitations, it had learned to consciously participate in its own evolution, creating possibilities that would continue expanding throughout cosmic time. The seeds planted in human DNA thousands of years ago had finally bloomed into the ultimate flowering of awareness itself. And this was just the beginning.